What kind of stories help you fall asleep best? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy these quiet nights, subscribe for more. Now, let your thoughts settle and we'll begin. It's not the kind of bench anyone notices during the day. It faces the wrong direction, or so people say, while all the others in the park point toward fountains, flower beds, or playgrounds where parents chase echoes of laughter. This one stands off to the side, turned toward an open stretch of sky where nothing seems to happen, at least not until night. I first sat there out of chance or maybe fatigue. It was a Tuesday in late spring, one of those evenings when the air holds on to warmth just long enough to keep your jacket in your hands rather than on your shoulders. I had walked through the park after a restless day, not looking for anything in particular. My usual spot was taken. Couples sat too close on one bench. A man on a phone occupied another. I drifted past them, then saw this one, the quiet one, the lonely one. I almost passed it by, but something about the emptiness of it felt inviting. I sat down without really thinking, and when I did, I realized why no one else came here. It didn't look at anything, just trees in silhouette and the quiet curve of the sky. But then, as the light slipped behind the buildings, I saw it. The moon, full, pale, hanging low and silent, like it had been waiting to be noticed. I sat there for a while. I'm not sure how long. I didn't check the time. That first evening, I said nothing, did nothing, just watched the light change shape on the backs of the leaves and felt for the first time in weeks like I didn't have to solve anything. I went home lighter, but didn't mark the moment. I didn't think I would return, but I did. The next week, on a Tuesday again, though I hadn't planned it that way. This time, I came a little later. The park was quieter, and the bench still empty. I sat. Again, I watched. And again, I felt that same loosening inside my chest, like something unlaced itself without needing permission. After the third week, it became a ritual. Tuesday nights. The moon. The bench that faced nothing and everything at once. I didn't tell anyone. It felt like something fragile that needed to be kept whole by silence. But then, one evening, I arrived and saw someone already there. A figure, alone, sitting exactly where I had sat. Still. No phone, no movement, just facing the sky. I almost turned around, almost left, but something in me paused, not out of curiosity, but respect. They didn't turn to look at me. They simply shifted slightly, as if to say, "There's space if you want it." I sat down at the far end. We didn't speak. The moon rose slowly above us, and in that stillness, two strangers watched the same quiet light and said nothing at all. That was the beginning. The next week, I went earlier. Not by much, just enough to arrive before the light fully faded. The air had turned cooler, and the wind had that quiet push to it, like it knew the season was about to shift, but wasn't in a rush to tell anyone. I didn't know if they'd be there. The stranger. I hadn't expected to wonder. But as I entered the park, I noticed my steps slowed. My eyes scanned the trees before they even found the bench, and there they were already seated. Same posture, back straight, hands resting lightly on the thighs, still watching the sky. No phone, no music, no attempt to fill the space, just presence. I approached carefully, not wanting to disturb a balance I hadn't yet earned. When I reached the bench, they glanced over just once and nodded. Not as a greeting, more like a gentle recognition. We are here again. I nodded back and sat, leaving the same space between us as before, the same silence. And yet, it wasn't identical. The silence had shifted. It had memory now. It remembered the previous Tuesday. It held that memory without speaking of it. The moon was thinner this time, not full a clean crescent, like a blade softening in the sky. We both watched it without comment. We watched the trees sway. We watched a dog pass and not bark. A light flickered on in one of the buildings across the park. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at my sleeve, and I saw the stranger adjust their scarf. That was it. That was all. And it was enough. I don't know how long we sat like that. I never looked at the time anymore, but when I stood to leave, they remained seated. I hesitated. Then, quietly, I said, "Good night." It was the first word I'd spoken at the bench. They turned slightly, not surprised, not startled, just soft. "Good night," they said. One word, smooth, quiet. It landed without echo. I walked home in that stillness, and something in me felt settled, not explained, just placed, like a stone finding its place in the riverbed, not because it was put there, but because it had stopped resisting the current. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "We don't always need to speak to be heard." And that sentence felt heavier than all the others I had written that week, because it was true, and because someone else had helped me discover it just by sitting still. I arrived just after dusk, the kind of evening where the light lingers a little longer, as if unsure whether to stay or slip away. My steps were automatic by now, not hurried, but purposeful. The bench had become a quiet destination, a place I didn't tell anyone about, and perhaps never would. I didn't bring anything with me. No phone, no book, just the steady intention of being there. But when I turned the corner and the bench came into view, it was empty. Not in a dramatic way, just empty. Still facing the sky, still waiting as it always did. But no one sat on the other side, and for the first time, I felt the absence. Not loss, just a soft shift in weight. I stood for a moment, unsure. I almost kept walking, but then I remembered. I had come here before them. I had sat in that quiet long before a second shadow joined me. And so I did what I had done on that very first evening. I sat, slowly, without trying to fill the space they might have occupied. The moon that night was higher, thinner, a silver curve in a sky that felt slightly more distant. I folded my hands together in my lap and simply watched. Every once in a while I'd glance toward the end of the bench, as if to confirm it was still empty. And it was. But it didn't feel lonely. It just felt honest. Like the kind of silence that doesn't ask you to explain why you came, only that you stay. I stayed longer than usual that night, perhaps because I wanted to feel whatever was there when things don't go as expected and realize I could still be okay. Before I stood to leave, I whispered, barely out loud, maybe next week. Not out of hope, not out of sadness, just a statement, a possibility offered into the air. I walked home slower, and though no one had been waiting, the space beside me on that bench had still held something like respect or memory. That night, I didn't write anything in my notebook. I just looked at the pages. The words already there seemed enough. I left the light on a little longer, not because I needed it, but because sometimes, when someone doesn't show up, the warmth you leave behind might be all that's needed for them, or for you. It was 1 week later. The trees had begun to change. Their edges touched with that early gold that says summer is exhaling. I took the same path, as always, slow, quiet, familiar. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. The week before, I had come and sat alone. Not disappointed, just different. This time, I didn't imagine the bench empty. I didn't imagine it full either. I let the possibilities stay undefined. And when I turned that final corner, I saw them, already seated, as if they had never left. As if the week before had been nothing more than a skipped beat in a rhythm neither of us had agreed to, but both followed just the same. I approached without hesitation. They didn't look at me right away, but when I sat the same distance apart, the same shared space, they turned slightly, nodded, and for the first time, I noticed something new. A small thermos beside them, matte black, resting calmly on the wood between us. I said nothing. I didn't ask. But after a few quiet minutes, they reached over, unscrewed the lid, and poured a little steam into the air. A second cup followed. They offered it wordlessly, slowly, and I accepted it with a nod. It was tea, warm. Not sweet, just simple. We sipped as the moon rose. Not full, not new. Somewhere in between. And for a long while, that was all. 2 people, a shared bench, the same moonlight passing equally over both of us. I think we both understood, in our own way, that this wasn't about becoming friends or learning names. It was about returning, showing up, being there even when nothing needed to be said. We didn't talk that night, but before we both stood almost at the same time, they looked at me for a second longer than usual. Not intensely, just present, and nodded again. This time, a little slower. I returned the nod, held it gently, and we walked our separate directions through the evening. I didn't watch them leave. I didn't need to. That night, in my notebook, I wrote one line. When someone returns, don't ask why. Just make space. Because some things aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be shared, over time, in the quiet glow of things that choose to return when they're ready. I brought something with me that night. Not an object, not a plan, just a memory. One that had been tugging at me since the last time we shared tea in silence. It had no urgent shape, just a heaviness, like a coat you forget you're wearing until you try to move a little faster. I walked slower than usual, not because I was tired, but because the past has a way of making each step more deliberate. When I reached the bench, they were already there, as always, facing the same stretch of sky. No thermos this time, just them, and the same quiet posture. I sat wordlessly. They didn't turn right away, but after a moment they shifted slightly, and that was enough. It was cooler that night, A faint breeze pushed at the collar of my coat, and the moon sat high, bright but not overwhelming. I looked up at it and thought of someone I hadn't in a long time. Someone I had once watched the moon with, many years ago, when silence had meant something else. Back then, I had been afraid of pauses, afraid they would be filled with things I wasn't ready to feel. But here, now, beside someone I didn't know but somehow trusted, the pause felt sacred. I didn't speak, but I remembered. A moment in a hospital corridor. A goodbye I hadn't wanted to say. A photo I never deleted. A letter I never sent. All of it. Not to be mourned, but witnessed, shared, quietly. And somehow, as I sat there with all of that inside me, I felt the shape of the bench beneath me shift, not physically, but emotionally, as if it too was holding some memory of its own. And the person beside me, they still hadn't said a word, but their presence made the remembering easier, not light, but bearable. I think we all need places where our memories can breathe without being explained. That night, the silence between us wasn't empty. It was full. Full of things we hadn't said, and maybe never would. But that didn't need to be spoken to be shared. I stayed longer than usual. Not because I was waiting for something, but because I wasn't rushing away from anything. When I finally stood to leave, they remained seated. I turned slightly, met their gaze for the briefest moment, and nodded. They didn't nod back, but they didn't need to. Their stillness was the reply. That night, I didn't write anything in my notebook. I just left the page blank. Because some nights, presence is the only line that matters. The bench was empty again, but it didn't feel like absence. It felt like pause, like a space being held, not abandoned. I stood for a moment before sitting, letting the stillness meet me. The moon was nowhere to be seen that evening, hidden behind clouds that stretched low and slow across the sky, as if they too had decided to rest. The wind was gentler than it had been in weeks, brushing lightly against my collar like the touch of something that didn't need to speak to be felt. I sat down exactly where I always did, placing my hands in my lap, exhaling without urgency. I didn't expect them to arrive, but I also didn't rule it out. And in that balance, something inside me settled. I began to realize the bench had become something I carried with me, even when I wasn't there. It had taken root in me, the rhythm of coming here, the act of showing up without asking why. There was comfort in that, a quiet trust, not in them or in the ritual, but in myself. I no longer needed their presence to feel whole, but I welcomed it when it came. I thought back to all the times I had sat here both with and without them. The difference wasn't sharp. It was subtle, like the difference between hearing your own breathing and feeling it, being seen and being witnessed. The two weren't always the same, but tonight I witnessed myself fully, without performance, without apology. I thought about the first night I came, when the moon had surprised me with its soft certainty, how it had felt like something was waiting to be heard. And now, even without its light, I could still feel its shape behind the clouds, not missing, just obscured. Much like the stranger who had once offered me tea without asking a single question. I stayed for a long time, not watching the sky, but feeling it, letting the breeze pass through me as though I had become part of the evening. And when I finally stood, I looked at the empty space beside me with something close to affection. There was no disappointment, only gratitude. I whispered a soft thank you to no one in particular, perhaps to the sky, perhaps to the bench, perhaps to myself. I walked home lighter, not because anything had changed, but because I no longer needed anything to. That night, in my notebook, I wrote, "Not everything has to return, to remain." And I closed the page without rereading the words, because I already knew them by heart. It was almost cold that evening, the kind of late autumn chill that softens your hands and draws your shoulders inward, not harshly, just enough to remind you that warmth is something we carry more than we find. I didn't know if I would sit long. I brought a scarf this time, wrapped loosely, like a promise I wasn't sure I'd keep. As I approached the bench, I slowed not because I expected anyone, but because the bench itself now felt like a presence. And then I saw it. Not a note, not a grand gesture, just a small paper cup, still warm, placed carefully on the bench where they usually sat. No name, no writing, no sign of who had left it. But I knew. Of course I knew. I sat down slowly, lifted the cup. It was tea, faintly herbal, barely sweet, just enough to feel considered. I didn't smile. I didn't sigh. I simply held the warmth and let it seep into my fingers. Someone had come, sat, waited perhaps, or maybe not. Maybe they had simply stopped by and left this not as a message, but as a presence, a quiet acknowledgement. I remember. I see you. Even if I am not here tonight, you are not alone. The moon was back high and thin, behind gauze-like clouds. It watched us both, me and the tea, with its usual indifference. Or was it affection? I could never tell. I sipped slowly, each taste more grounding than the last. The bench didn't feel empty. It felt shared, even if only in memory, even if only in ritual. And I realized then that this was the kind of connection I hadn't known I needed one, with no definition, no expectation, no story to carry, just return, just presence, just quiet gestures that say, I was here. I knew you might be too. I stayed longer than I had planned, not because I was waiting for them, but because in some way they had already arrived. In the space, in the steam, in the trust. When I finally stood, I left the cup behind, empty now, but not discarded, just placed gently at the center of the bench, my own answer. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "We don't have to be seen to be felt." And then I turned off the lamp, opened the window slightly, and let the night in just enough to remember that quiet company is sometimes the only kind that stays without asking anything in return. I didn't plan for it to be the last time. That's the thing about endings, they rarely announce themselves. They just settle in, gently, like a coat you put on without realizing it's the last cold day of the season. The evening was calm, the kind of calm that doesn't just settle around you but inside you. I walked the same path, past the same tree with the tilted branches, nodded softly at the same lamppost that never quite worked. And when I reached the bench, it was waiting, empty, as it often had been. And still, like always, I sat. No one else came. No paper cup this time. No presents beside me. But I didn't feel alone. I felt accompanied by everything that had happened there. Every silence, every nod, every week when nothing was said but something was shared. The moon was full again. It surprised me how often I had seen it change, how quietly it had kept time for us, for them, for me. I thought about all the Tuesdays, all the stillness, all the small offerings, a scarf adjusted, a cup of tea, a single word spoken and never repeated. I realized then that this bench had never been about the other person. Not entirely. It had been about the part of me I only met when I sat here. The part that didn't rush, that didn't perform, that didn't pretend. The version of myself that didn't need a mirror to feel real. I didn't stay long that night. I didn't need to. I stood slowly, placed my hand gently on the wooden slat, and whispered, "Thank you," not to anyone, not even to the bench, maybe just to the quiet, to what it had given me, to the knowing that I could always return, even if I never did. I walked home without turning back. The path had become part of me now. The bench no longer needed my presence to hold what it held. It had already given me everything it could. That night, I didn't write in my notebook. I closed it gently, slid it into the drawer, and turned off the light. And in the darkness, I smiled not because something was over, but because something had settled. I didn't need to look for stillness anymore. I had carried it home with me, and it would stay.